How could one man manipulate the world's elite, abuse dozens of young girls, and still walk free for decades? The story of Jeffrey Epstein doesn't just show us a crime, it shows us the rot at the top of our society. In this video, we'll talk about all of the main points that have happened in the saga of Epstein. So buckle in, as this is not a happy story. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th of 1953 to a Jewish family in New York. He had a relatively normal upbringing, with his father, Seymour Epstein, working as a groundskeeper and maintenance man for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and his mother, Pauline Epstein, who was a homemaker and school aide. He proved to be relatively smart, even skipping 2 grades and attending Cooper Union and New York University, but never graduated with a degree. This made it surprising when he landed a job at the Dalton School, a famous college preparatory school for New York's elite. Interestingly, the headmaster at the school at the time was a man named Donald Barr, who wrote a science fiction novel called Space Relations, where there's a planet ruled by a corrupt elite who have children as sex slaves. Though Barr was ending his time working at the school right when Epstein was beginning his, it's still quite the coincidence, don't you think? Though Epstein's own tenure at the school did not last long, as he was dismissed for poor performance, he did make a number of good acquaintances, one of which was Alan Greenberg, the CEO of Bear Stearns, a large investment bank in New York. This is how Epstein began working in finance. Though Epstein started as a junior assistant to a floor trader, he amazingly managed to quickly climb the ranks into being a financial advisor to some of the bank's wealthiest clients. He later even became a limited partner, though that soon ended because of a Reg D violation. By the way, a Reg D violation refers to the breaking of the rules outlined in Regulation D of the U.S. Securities Act of 1933, a key set of laws governing how companies can raise money from investors without formally registering their securities with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Back to the story. Now unemployed, it was time for him to build his own consulting firm, which he called Intercontinental Assets Group, or IAG for short. There isn't actually a lot of information online about this company, and I can't find their financial records. Though it seems that Epstein was relatively successful at this point, it certainly is not how he made his fortunes. And that's where the story gets even weirder. In 1987, Epstein got one of the most lucrative gigs that he would ever get. He began working as a consultant for Towers Financial Corporation, a collection agency that bought debts owed to hospitals, banks, and phone companies, led by American businessman Steve Hoffenberg. Surprise, surprise, this turned out to be a giant Ponzi scheme that lost over $450 million of its investors' dollars and caused it to go out of business. But did Epstein get in trouble for this? No. In this July 2021 article in Rolling Stone by Vicky Ward, who met with Stephen Hoffenberg during his 18-year stint in prison, he outlined how he and Epstein attempted to con people out of money. The article says, quote, Hoffenberg said that Epstein had a term for the perfect execution of the grift. He called it playing the box, which meant that he ensured that even if his crime was uncovered, the victim would be unable to do anything about it, either because of social embarrassment or because the money was tucked away in a place where they couldn't either find it or get it. What Hoffenberg had failed to realize, he told me, is that Epstein could con him. Epstein would take $100 million of Towers' money, move it offshore, and meanwhile cooperate with U.S. prosecutors against Hoffenberg, who was unable to do anything about this because he pleaded guilty, which meant there was no trial and therefore no discovery, end quote. But that's only the start of the weirdness here. The article goes on to say, Hoffenberg also knew something else Epstein wanted hidden. According to Hoffenberg, he claimed that Epstein moved in intelligence circles. Hoffenberg told me that in the 1980s, after Epstein left Bear Stearns in ignominious circumstances, Epstein was trained in moving money offshore, and that a mentor of Epstein's was someone Hoffenberg knew, a British defense contractor who died in 2011 named Douglas Leese. Hoffenberg claimed that Leese was an arms dealer. Leese's son Julian says this is not true, but the UK parliamentary record does not mention Leese in reference to the Al Yamama arms deal of the early 1980s. I remember distinctly that in our first meeting, Hoffenberg told me that Leese was pivotal in understanding Jeffrey's MO, because Leese had introduced him not only to aristocratic Europeans, who Epstein subsequently fleeced, but to all sorts of people in the arms business, including the late Turkish-born businessman Adnan Khashoggi, and allegedly the late media mogul Robert Maxwell, end quote. So now I'm going to take a moment to pause here on that man, Robert Maxwell. Who was he? Well, he was an ultra-wealthy British businessman who Epstein helped get some financial trouble straightened out for. Much of Maxwell's money was made through stealing pension funds from his employees at the publishing house Pergamon Press, though in the early days he helped establish a connection between Czechoslovakian communists and the newly born nation of Israel during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. These aircraft parts allowed Israel to win through establishing air superiority. Even more interestingly, Robert Maxwell allegedly was tied to a scandal where a bugged version of the software Promise, which was in a database system used by prosecutors' offices to manage case information, track criminal proceedings, and store data on case disposition and outcomes, to a number of nations so that Israel could spy on them. This includes the Sandia National Laboratory and Los Alamos National Laboratory, which are United States nuclear research and security facilities. During this time, journalist Danny Casolaro was investigating what he called the octopus. Casolaro's work focused on a complex web of scandals that included the Inslaw case, which is the alleged theft of software by the Department of Justice, the Iran-Contra affair, and other secret government dealings. Casolaro believed these events were all interconnected through a shadowy international cabal he named the Octopus. In August 1991, Casolaro was found dead in a hotel room in Martinsburg, West Virginia, with his wrists slashed. Authorities ruled his death a suicide, but his friends and family strongly disputed this conclusion. They point to Casolaro's previous statements that he would never take his own life, and a lack of definitive evidence supporting the suicide verdict. In fact, his cleaner had received several calls to the house in the previous days that were threatening his life. The Inslaw scandal was tied to Promise software, which is what Maxwell was tied to. A man who had formerly worked for Israel's military intelligence directorate named Ari Ben Menashe came out and publicly said that Maxwell was an agent of Mossad and that he had been involved with the Promise software, and that he had ratted out Mordecai Vanunu, who revealed information about Israel's nuclear capabilities to a few British papers, and was subsequently kidnapped by Mossad and smuggled back to Israel to be sentenced. Ari even alleged that Epstein was working for Mossad himself. Not long after this, Maxwell mysteriously drowned on his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named after his daughter. That's right, this was Ghislaine Maxwell's father. Though it was ruled an accident, likely from a heart attack which caused him to fall into the water, some aren't so sure that this was an accident. Maxwell was buried in Israel after a lavish funeral attended by Israeli Prime Minister Itzhak Shamir and Israeli President Chaim Herzog. It does certainly seem like Maxwell was well connected in Israel, doesn't it? And it seems that Epstein had strong ties to both British intelligence and the Israeli intelligence. Now let's return to that article I was reading earlier by Vicky Ward. She says, 4 separate sources told me on the record that Epstein's dealings in the arms world in the 1980s had led him to work for multiple governments, including the Israelis. The sources, who range from former arms dealers to former spies, and also Hoffenberg, suggest that Epstein, who lacked any sort of moral compass, decided to go one step further and compromise influential people by recording them doing things they wouldn't want to make public, end quote. Here we can see the beginnings of what we now call the Epstein files. She goes on to say, and once he got out of jail, in the last 10 years of his life, Epstein bragged to various people, including journalists, that he was advising a whole assortment of foreign leaders, who included Vladimir Putin, Mohammed bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Salman, various African dictators, Israel, the British, and of course, the Americans. He also told several of the same people that he was making a fortune out of arms, drugs, and diamonds. He told one person, journalist Edward J. Epstein, that he knew the owner of the deepwater port of Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, a smuggler's paradise, so well that he was basically in charge of it. Now, according to my source in the intelligence world, this is hyperbole, but also not completely ridiculous. His name was mentioned as a middleman in both Africa and the Middle East. He was known in the intelligence world as a hyper-fixer, somebody who can go between different cultures and networks. Usually these people are very silent about what they do, and yet Epstein was not silent. He had a photo of the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, on the wall, and photos of Bill Gates and all of the VIPs who flocked to his salons. It's not wholly surprising, therefore, that the same sources who say they know he was some sort of intelligence asset say that he'd become a liability, which is why, possibly, he lost any protection and was arrested. A handful of people I interviewed, including former Mossad agent Viktor Ostrovsky, maintain that this is exactly what happened to Robert Maxwell, which is why they say Maxwell was killed. His financial problems were about to make him vulnerable, end quote. So now I think we're getting a little bit better picture of Epstein and his money. He's working with intelligence agencies, he's getting dirt on the world's elite, and he's smuggling arms, drugs, and diamonds. So now let's take a moment to return to finance so we can see where he got more of his money. With Epstein leaving Towers Financial Corporation and basically narking on his business partner, Steve Hoffenberg, he now needed new work. He formed another company known as J. Epstein & Company, which was a financial management firm. Later, the name was changed to Financial Trust Company and was moved to the island of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands to save on taxes. Though we don't know many of the clients that Epstein managed for, we do know at least a few of them. As you can see from the pie chart created by Forbes, his company accumulated $480 million in client fees from the years 1999 to 2018, the vast majority of that coming from just two clients, Leon Black and Lex Wexner. Lex Wexner was the chairman and CEO of L Brands, which eventually split into two separate companies, Bath & Body Works and Victoria's Secret. Epstein and Wexner became so close that Epstein was Wexner's power of attorney, which gave him full power over all of Wexner's affairs. Epstein even lived in some of Wexner's houses. Leon Black was the co-founder and the former CEO of the private equity firm Apollo Global Management. Epstein was also the president of the Bermuda incorporated company Liquid Funding Ltd. Between 2000 and 2007. This company specialized in structuring and securitizing complex toxic debt, where the lender would ask for securities from the borrower that they'd agree to buy back at a later time and price. They became known as mortgage-backed securities. To make these toxic assets appear safer, Liquid Funding worked with credit rating agencies to get them undeservedly high AAA ratings. This eventually led to an implosion, which we all remember as the 2008 financial crisis. This company initially was 40% owned by Bear Stearns, which we previously mentioned. Epstein himself invested $57 million into Bear Stearns in 2006, but by mid-2007 was trying to pull out his money. However, this request was denied, and not long after, the company folded over with the implosion of the market. All of his money was lost, except that JP Chase ended up buying the company, and Epstein was able to sue them for some undisclosed amount of money. So as you can see, Epstein was accumulating millions upon millions of dollars, with his estimated total net worth at the time of his death in 2019 to be around $600 million. But his insanely lavish lifestyle, with numerous houses, private jets, and even two private islands, would indicate an even greater amount of wealth than that. An article by Forbes said that, quote, "The full extent of Epstein's wealth and client list is still unknown, though further details may be public soon enough." On July 17th, Senator Ron Wyden revealed that investigators from the Senate Financial Committee had reviewed some of the Treasury Department files on Epstein last year. They found that there are more than 4,700 transactions with Epstein's account at four banks: JP Chase, Deutsche Bank, Bank of New York Mellon, and Bank of America, totaling more than $1.9 billion. But of course, money isn't all that Epstein is known for. Now we're going to take a look at the darker side of the man. Quoting from the Department of Justice, quote, "The Palm Beach, Florida Police Department began investigating Jeffrey Epstein in 2005 after the parents of a 14-year-old girl complained that Epstein had paid her for a massage. The investigation led to the discovery that Epstein used personal assistants to recruit girls to provide massages to him, and in many instances, those massages led to sexual activity." End quote. Despite extensive evidence gathered by the police and the state attorney office in Palm Beach presenting a limited case to a grand jury, this resulted in Epstein being charged with only a single misdemeanor, which police deemed highly unusual. Outraged by the weak state charges, the Palm Beach police chief urged the FBI to open a federal investigation, which was officially codenamed Operation Leap Year in July 2006. While federal prosecutors built a strong case and drafted a 53-page indictment, the investigation was ultimately cut short. In 2008, U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta secretly negotiated a non-prosecution agreement that gave Epstein immunity from federal charges in exchange for a lenient plea deal in the state court. This deal was done without the victims being notified, a violation of their rights. Perhaps the name Alexander Acosta rings a bell to you. Well, that's because he was the Secretary of Labor from 2017 to 2019 under President Trump. So Epstein got a plea deal on June 30th of 2008, pleading guilty to two state charges: felony solicitation of prostitution and solicitation of prostitution involving a minor. He received an 18-month sentence in the Palm Beach County Jail, but served only 13 months, and most of his time was spent on a work release program. This allowed him to leave jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to visit his office. So why did Acosta give him such a lenient deal? Well, there are a few conflicting stories that go on here. In July 2019, shortly after Epstein was arrested on new sex trafficking charges, a report by Talking Points Memo claimed that Acosta had been told during the 2008 case that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence and to, quote, leave it alone, end quote. The source of this claim was not named, and this has made people believe that Epstein worked with American intelligence, though it's hard to find any other source of Acosta saying this. The other story is from the Department of Justice in this investigation, which says, quote, "On July 10, 2019, Acosta held a televised press conference to defend his and the USAO's action Acosta stated that the Palm Beach State Attorney Office, quote, was ready to allow Epstein to walk free with no jail time, nothing, end quote. According to Acosta, because USAO prosecutors considered this outcome unacceptable, his office pursued a difficult and challenging case and obtained a resolution that put Epstein in jail, forced him to register as a sexual offender, and provided victims with the means to obtain monetary damages, end quote. I mean, come on, you've got to admit that's pretty suspicious. Also, Alan Dershowitz, who was one of Epstein's lawyers at the time, was accused by Epstein accuser Virginia Giuffre of being one of the men who repeatedly sexually assaulted her when she was a minor. But she later said, quote, I now recognize I may have made a mistake in identifying Mr. Dershowitz, end quote. Unfortunately, Virginia's name will come up again later. So after all of this, Epstein reformed his life and cleaned up his disgusting ways, right? Obviously not. They continued what was essentially a pyramid scheme of sexual abuse, where Ghislaine and him would recruit young ladies to bring their friends over to his various houses for massages, which would then turn sexual. These girls would be paid a few $100s and then sent on their way, and if they brought their friends back next time, they would get extra money. He and Ghislaine worked constantly to put themselves amongst great minds as well, often investing in science and technology. Through his program, the Jeffrey Epstein 6 Foundation, he pledged $30 million to Harvard for the program for evolutionary dynamics, also known by the pseudonym the PED program, which is hilarious. In 2003, with the university receiving $6.5 million, he also donated $800,000 to MIT, and he palled around with great scientists like Martin Novak, Stephen Hawking, and Lawrence Krauss. He also palled around with some of the world's elite, like Prince Andrew, who was named by Virginia Giuffre as one of the men who had sex with her as a minor. He was extremely good friends with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who traveled with him regularly. He was friends with the Rothschilds, the king of sexual misconduct himself, Harvey Weinstein, the Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Bill Gates, Mette-Marit, the Crown Princess of Norway, former President Bill Clinton, current President Donald Trump, and countless more. According to factcheck.org, Clinton was on Epstein's plane 26 times during 6 trips between February 9th, 2002 and November 4th, 2003. That's according to flight logs that were unsealed as part of the lawsuit brought by one of Epstein's accusers. There were 26 flights because some of the 6 trips included multiple stops. Clinton traveled to places such as London, Hong Kong, Oslo, Beijing, and several African countries. Business Insider later reported in July 2020 that Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's victims, who died by suicide this year, wrote in an unpublished memoir, which was unsealed as part of the lawsuit against Maxwell, that she saw Clinton on the island. Also, one of Clinton's former aides, Doug Band, told Vanity Fair for a December 2020 story that Clinton once visited the island in January 2023. We note that Trump also was a guest on Epstein's planes, taking at least 7 flights with him during the 1990s, according to flight logs released during Maxwell's trial. But as with Clinton, those logs do not indicate that Trump ever flew to Epstein's private island, end quote. From the early 1990s to the mid-2000s, Trump and Epstein were pretty good friends, floating in similar circles and regularly enjoying the nightlife together, with Epstein being a member of Mar-a-Lago, Trump's luxury club and resort. This is the time period in which we now get the infamous Trump quote, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It's even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. No doubt about it, Jeffrey enjoys his social life," end quote. Supposedly, their relationship soured when they got into a bidding war over a $40 million mansion in Palm Beach, with Trump eventually proving victorious. Trump has also claimed that he kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago for being creepy with the staff, though the actual timeline in which Epstein was no longer allowed at Mar-a-Lago is murky, and there's debate about when this actually happened. With all these powerful connections and his extremely corrupt and perverted lifestyle, this is how the Epstein Files was created. Epstein regularly hosted lavish parties at his various residences, such as his mansion in New York or his other mansion in Palm Beach. Most notoriously, he would fly elites and young girls to his private island of Little St. James in the US Virgin Islands. The plane he used was nicknamed the Lolita Express, and if you've read that novel, you're gonna get the reference there. It's alleged that Epstein had his house and planes wired for video and audio to catch people doing things that they would not want to be made public. Originally, when Epstein's home was raided in 2005, before his first conviction, his assistant Adriana Ross removed multiple computers and hard drives from his residence, which were never found by authorities. However, they did find large numbers of pictures of nude women around the house, and his former housekeeper said he personally received 3 massages a day from underage women. He worked with a man named Jean-Luc Brunel to create the MC2 modeling agency, which was essentially a front for human sex trafficking. These girls were used for his personal perversion as well as potentially for his friends. Interestingly, Brunel was arrested in 2020 and tried for sex trafficking and ended up allegedly committing suicide as well, though of course many people are super skeptical about this. Epstein told a journalist with the New York Times in August 2018 that he, quote, had dirt on powerful people, including details about their supposed sexual proclivities and recreational drug use, end quote. And we have another interesting quote from one of Epstein's victims, which says, quote, the main thing he did when I walked in, and I thought was interesting, he showed me where the cameras, the men monitoring everything were. So if you're facing the house, there's a window on the right-hand side that's barred. That's the media room, is what he called it. And so there was a door that looked like an invisible door with all this limestone and everything. And you push it and you go in. And I saw all the cameras. It was like old televisions basically, like stacked, end quote. And she went on to say, quote, there were monitors inside this cabinet and there were men sitting here. And I looked on the cameras and I saw toilet, toilet, bed, bed, toilet, bed. I'm like, I'm never gonna use the restroom here and I'm never gonna sleep here. You know what I mean? It's very obvious that they were like monitoring private moments, end quote. During the most recent raid of his home, the FBI said that they found compact discs locked in a safe in his New York mansion. I quote them here, saying, quote, to ensure that the review was thorough, the FBI conducted digital searches of its databases, hard drives, and network drives, as well as physical searches of squad areas, locked cabinets, desks, closets, and other areas where the responsible material may have been stored. These searches uncovered a significant amount of material, including more than 300 gigabytes of data and physical evidence. The files related to Epstein include a large volume of images of Epstein, images and videos of victims who are either minors or appear to be minors, and over 10,000 downloaded videos and images of illegal child sex abuse material and other pornography, end quote. Though we don't know much about what's specifically in these photos and videos, it likely isn't just him committing these acts. This all came after his July 6th of 2019 arrest and the raid of his Manhattan townhouse. On July 8th, prosecutors with the Public Corruption Unit of the Southern District of New York, under Jeffrey Berman, charged him with sex trafficking and conspiracy to traffic minors for sex. He was denied bail, seeing as he was likely a flight risk. On July 23, 2019, Epstein was found semi-conscious with scratches around his neck. His cellmate, former New York City police officer Nicholas Tartaglione, denied having any knowledge of what happened. Though officers suspected it was a suicide attempt, some believe it was caused by his cellmate, while others believe it was faked in order to get moved. This did land him on suicide watch for a period of 6 days before it was believed that his mood was improved enough that he was no longer a risk. On August 8th, Epstein signed his last will and testament with his longtime advisors Derek Indike and Richard Kahn in charge of his trust. Epstein was placed in a special housing unit where he was supposed to have a cellmate and have a guard check in on him every 30 minutes. However, controversially, these procedures were not followed. On August 9th, 2019, his cellmate was transferred out without a replacement, and his guards that were supposed to check on him allegedly fell asleep at their post during this specific evening. 2 cameras in the front of Epstein's cell also malfunctioned that night, and another camera had footage that was unusable. On August 16th, Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Barbara Sampson announced that Epstein's death had been ruled a suicide via hanging. However, Epstein's lawyers were not happy with that. They hired forensic pathologist Michael Baden to investigate. On October 30th, 2019, Baden issued a report stating that Epstein's neck injuries were much more consistent with homicidal strangulation than suicide. He stated that Epstein had 2 fractures on the left and right sides of the larynx, specifically the thyroid cartilage or Adam's apple, as well as 1 fracture on the left hyoid bone above the Adam's apple. In particular, Baden claimed that Epstein's hyoid bone was broken in a way indicative of strangulation from behind. Also, Baden said the fact that the neck wound was more in the center of Epstein's neck indicated that it was suspicious because it's typically under the mandible in a hanging. And he also said that the wound looked thinner than a strip of bedsheet and that the blood on Epstein's neck was absent on the sheet. Despite all this, Sampson still ruled the death a suicide. This was followed by a confirmation from the Justice Department Inspector General and an FBI investigation. That hasn't really convinced the American public, though, nor the people close to Epstein. His lawyers aren't convinced, his brother isn't convinced, Ghislaine isn't convinced, and his girlfriend, Karina Shuliak, spoke to him earlier that day, and she didn't think that he seemed to be in bad spirits at all. All of this led to the famous phrase, Epstein didn't kill himself. On July 2nd, 2020, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested by the FBI in Bradford, New Hampshire. She was charged in federal court in Manhattan with multiple offenses, including enticement of a minor to travel for the purposes of sexual activity, transporting a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual behavior, conspiracy to commit those offenses, and perjury related to sworn disposition in 2016. The alleged timeframe for the underlying acts was roughly 1994 to 1997, and the charges allege she helped recruit, groom, and facilitate access of underage girls to Jeffrey Epstein. Bail was denied, with the court citing concerns about her finances, her history of evasion, and her status as a flight risk. Ghislaine's trial commenced in late 2021. In December 2021, a jury found her guilty on 5 out of 6 counts, including conspiracy, sex trafficking of a minor, transporting a minor for illicit sexual activity in connection with her role in Epstein's abuse network. On July 28, 2022, she was sentenced in Manhattan to 20 years in prison by Judge Allison J. Nathan. Maxwell appealed her conviction. In September 2024, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit affirmed her conviction, and the lower court's rulings rejecting claims that Epstein's prior non-prosecution agreement should have barred her prosecution, among other arguments. In July 2025, the Department of Justice filed a brief asking the U.S. Supreme Court to reject her petition to review her conviction. After sentencing, Maxwell was held in federal prison. For a time, she was at the low-security facility in Tallahassee, Florida. In August 2025, she was transferred to federal prison camp Bryan in Texas. Her projected release date under the sentence is July 17, 2037. So now let's talk about the aftermath. Well, sadly, the main accuser of Epstein, Virginia Giuffre, committed suicide on April 25th of 2025. Though, of course, there is speculation that something happened to her. Of course, she did have a very traumatic life, and God rest her soul. Both Trump and the director of the FBI, Kash Patel, have been continually gaslighting us, basically telling us that there's nothing to see here, guys. On July 15th, 2025, Representative Thomas Massie submitted House Resolution 119581, co-sponsored by Ro Khanna, to force the Department of Justice to release the Epstein files. The same pair announced on August 12th that they would bring a number of Epstein's victims to the Capitol on September 3rd, the day the House returns from August vacation. On August 25th, 2025, the House Oversight Committee issued a subpoena to Acosta requesting his testimony in the Epstein files. Over September and October 2025, the House Oversight Committee released tens of thousands of pages of files related to Epstein, but the October 2025 government shutdown temporarily stalled the congressional investigation and the release of additional files. So that's where we're at today. It's up to us to keep pressure on Trump and the rest of his government to release all of the Epstein files so that we can expose all of these disgusting people, as they all deserve to be taken down. So that's it for this one. I'm Cameron Whiteley, and thanks for watching.